The two questions that I get more than any others are, why are we always broke, and why can't you people in Sacramento ever get a budget on time? Why are we always broke, and why can't you, in any conversation, by the way, that starts with why can't you people in Sacramento is not a good conversation. I can tell you that from experience. So let's try and answer those two questions. Why are we always broke? In order to have the conversation about why we're always broke, you have to go all the way back to the late 1990s. So from 1996-97 budget year to the year 2000 and 2001, California's budget grew by almost 60% in just 4 years. A little less than $50 billion for what we call our general fund budget that pays for K-12 education, higher education, health and welfare, corrections, and everything else. 50 billion, a little less in 96-97, goes up 60% in just 4 years to 2000, 2001. Why was that happening, and how is that possible? Well, you will all remember that the late 90s were a real go-go period in terms of California's economy, and as the money flooded in, folks in Sacramento, and I want to be very clear here, both a Republican governor, Pete Wilson, and a Democratic governor, Gray Davis, Democrats and Republicans in the legislature, because it takes a 2/3 vote to pass the budget. So both the legislature and the governors, both Democrats and Republicans, said, well, this is great. We got all this money flooding in. We're going to grow state government, which in many cases means we're going to send more money to our local school districts. We're going to send more money to our counties for health care and welfare. And then the question was, well, if it takes a 2/3 vote to make that 60% growth happen, how did Democrats persuade Republicans that it was okay to grow government that much, that fast? And the answer was that so much money was flooding in that Democrats could say to Republicans, tell you what, while we're growing government, we're actually going to cut taxes and fees at the same time. So Republicans like that half of the equation. Democrats like the spending part of the equation. And so taxes and fees were rolled back. All of you will remember the vehicle license fee. That got rolled back. That was a $4 billion a year item at the time. Pretty big chunk of change for the state. That got rolled back, as did billions in other various tax costs. And if you're an elected official in the late 1990s, that is the best of both worlds, because you get to go home and you get to say to people, I am giving you more and I am charging you less. It doesn't get any better than that. So 60% growth in just 4 years. Now, I want to tell you, for those of you who are asked what's happened over the last 10 years, the governor's current general fund budget proposal for this year, this is the budget year we don't have a budget for, is $83.4 billion, which is a 7% growth rate over 10 years. That's before we deal with inflation, before we deal with population growth. So a 60% growth in just those last 4 years of the 90s, 7% over the 10 years that have followed, given the circumstances. Now, it would have been difficult enough to make all that work with a 60% growth rate in just 4 years. But as I said, while we were going like that on spending, this is my PowerPoint presentation, by the way, for all of you who, while we're doing like that on spending, we gave away all of the revenues that were going to be needed when tough times came in order to support those programs. So sure enough, just look at stock options and capital gains, which grew from $8 billion for the state's revenue in the year 98-99, 2 years later, had jumped up to $17 billion. So $8 billion to $17 billion in just 2 years. The state built that into the state's budget as if it were an ongoing source of annual revenue. I suspect that there are many people in the room who have experienced the fact that that did not turn out to be an ongoing source of annual revenue. And in fact, the following year, 2001, 2002, when I was in the legislature, I was elected in 2000, that $17 billion number dropped to $6 billion for the state, creating overnight an $11 billion budget shortfall, which is no small number when you're talking about a total budget of 80, now up to $83.5 billion. Now, why do I give you this history from the late 1990s? There are two important reasons. The first and most important reason is because I want to take the opportunity to tell you I wasn't there when these decisions were made, okay? So, and let me just say, I know we're all looking forward to hearing from Jim Kineen a little later in the day, all right? No. In fairness, though, I've got 10 years to answer for. So the obvious question is, why hasn't it gotten fixed in the last 10 years? All right, so there we are. And here's the reason it hasn't gotten fixed. First question is, why are we always broke? Second question is, why can't we ever get a budget on time? You would think it's fairly straightforward. If you don't have enough money to balance your budget, what do? Spend less, collect more, do it now, because the longer you let it go, the worse it gets. So that's my 7-word budget mantra and has been for a decade. Spend less, collect more, do it now. If you do that, you'll solve the problem. If you don't, you won't. We haven't, and we haven't. Spend less, collect more, do it now. What's the problem? We have a couple of impediments in terms of the way California does its budget and taxing at the state level. Many of you know that we are one of just 3 states in the country that has a 2/3 requirement, here's the PowerPoint again, a 2/3 requirement for a budget to be passed. That means every year that a small minority of the minority party, and this would be true in my judgment whether it's Democrats or Republicans. As it happens, in California, Democrats are the majority in the legislature, Republicans are the minority. The small minority of the minority party gets to dictate terms for the budget to the majority party. And irony of ironies, 1 or 2 or 3 people in the minority party every year actually have more say about what your state budget will look like than the entire majority does in either the Senate or the state assembly. So when you get to the place where you need a 2/3 vote in the Senate, which has 40 members, 27 members is a majority, excuse me, a 2/3 majority. If there are 25 members in the majority party, the most powerful 2 people in the room are the 2 members of the minority party who are willing to cross the line. They get to set the terms for the budget. Now, that means that every year we are stuck. Now, I mentioned that we are one of just 3 states that has this system. The other 2, which raises the obvious question, well, how do the other states manage? Other 2 are Arkansas and Rhode Island. Neither one of them are exactly templates for California, but still, I asked, as I sort of worked this through for myself, well, how do they get it done? And then what I discovered is they are both states where both houses of the legislature are controlled by 2/3 majorities, which means that as a practical matter, the only state in the country that has to get a 2/3 majority without 2/3 control in both houses is the state of California. To make it that much more challenging, California is the only state in the country that requires both a 2/3 majority to pass the budget and a 2/3 majority to pass tax increases. So we have a 2/3 times 2 challenge to make anything work. Now, entirely apart from your views about levels of spending, and in a minute I'm going to try and persuade you that levels of spending have not been the problem over the last decade, the challenge with the current system is that no one is accountable. If you go to the majority party, they will say, I will tell you, don't blame me. We voted for a budget. Not once, not twice, but 3 times, and we did it on time. You need to blame those people in the minority party who won't give us the votes we need to pass the budget. If you go talk to those folks in the minority party, they'll say, don't blame us. Our constituents did not elect us to vote for a budget that we don't believe in. And by the way, what part of they're the majority do they not want to acknowledge? That leaves you more or less frustrated and angry. Usually more, in my experience. And let me suggest to you that the reason we're frustrated and angry is because neither party can be held accountable. And the system is fundamentally broken if the people who elect us cannot hold us accountable. So my pitch to you on the measure that's on the ballot this fall, which would call for a simple majority for the budget, not for tax increases, but just for the budget, is if you want to be able to hold people in office accountable, then you need to give them the authority they need to make decisions. And let me just say it in partisan terms now. If Democrats spend too much of your money and you don't like it, vote them out. If Republicans cut your services too much and you don't like it, vote them out. Now, having said that, if you're going to be intellectually honest, I think you then have to say that means we need a system where people can be held accountable. And that's why I supported the reapportionment and redistricting measure, which a lot of Democrats and a lot of legislators didn't, because my view was I couldn't be intellectually consistent and say, you need to hold us accountable, but I want to create a system where we have safe seats and you can't hold us accountable. So I think that is a modest and good step forward. I also supported the open primary, which I thought, again, was important towards not so much finding, quote, moderates, but forcing elected officials to find common ground is probably the way I would put it, so that Democrats and Republicans come from districts and represent constituencies which force them to speak to the interests of their entire district, not just a minority of one party that turns out in a primary election. I think those are two good steps going forward. But I think until and unless we tackle the 50% plus one majority rather than the 2/3 majority, we're going to be stuck. Now, I want to just wrap up with a couple of other observations before we go to questions, because I understand we have about 5 minutes for questions. We have to get past, some of you will know, I was a former school board president, then a local mayor here in Palo Alto, then a county supervisor where I served with Blanca Alvarado, and we had a great time together. And then, well, I'm just going to digress here and give people, I'm just going to tell you what people said. They always thought we were an odd couple, didn't they, Blanca? Okay. Here's this like younger button-down suit guy from Palo Alto, and you know they always said Palo Alto with kind of a look. And then here's this, you know, slightly more mature Latina from East San Jose, and the two of us worked together on the Children and Families Committee, and one of the things we did was find the common ground. And so, for example, on a lot of issues, the common ground got found because Blanca pushed something called data-driven services, which was a fancy way of saying, could we start looking at the numbers instead of the politics when we allocate dollars? And Blanca, whose district had, as I recall, what percentage of the county's welfare population? I think it was 35% of the county's welfare population in her 20% of the county. My district had 3.5% of the county's welfare population, but we had common purpose because Blanca's district was underfunded, and guess what? So was mine, because nobody thought there were people of modest means in the North County. They thought we were prosperous. Where am I going with this? If you talk to cities, they'll tell you they're not getting their fair share. If you talk to school districts, they'll tell you they're not getting their fair share. If you talk to counties, they'll tell you they're not getting their fair share. Everybody likes to blame the state, which is fine because the state blames the feds. But what we need to do is start thinking not so much about this as city money, school money, county money, state money, but, and here I'm going to sound very Republican, it is after all the taxpayers' money. It is the public's money. If you want to go out and toss a ball around with your kid on a piece of green grass, you probably don't care whether it's a schoolyard, a city park, a county park, a state park. You're just looking for some green to go out and toss the ball around with your kid. So we need to start rethinking the balkanization of public services that we've got here in California if we're going to make our financial system work as well.